Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, in today's news, Spain is again at the centre of the European crisis. The weekend saw big demonstrations in towns and cities across the country. And today we're going to be looking more closely at what makes Spain unique in modern Europe, perhaps above all her civil war and its long legacy of dictatorship and the decision to forget, or try to forget, which followed the return to democracy. Maria Delgado's father was a refugee in the 1930s, and she's a historian of Spanish theatre and film. Daniel Hannon's a conservative Eurosceptic MEP and a long-term Hispanophile, if that's the word. It makes him sound a little bit like a very fine veteran car. Ian Begg's an economist specialising in European integration and governance, but we're going to start with a remarkable new account of the Spanish Civil War and its legacy by Paul Preston, which is called The Spanish Holocaust, Inquisition and Extermination in 20th Century Spain. Well, those are big words to be using about a dictator, Franco, who has been in many ways put in a slightly different category than the other monsters of the 20th century.
Well, in fact, part of the choice of those words was, in a sense, a response to the fact that Franco has such a good press in the Anglo-Saxon world. And the fact that he has such a good press is largely to do with the fact that there were more than 30 years after the end of the Second World War in which he and his regime, with control of the media and the education system, were able to, if you like, peddle a particular version of what happened. And of course, they also benefited greatly from the sense that they were important allies of the West during the Cold War, and perhaps above all, had 30 years in which to destroy the evidence. So Franco's reputation as a benign dictator is hardly merited.
Well, let's come on to the details in a moment, but I suppose the other thing is that for an awful lot of British people who are interested in Spain in that period, we see things through the spectacles of George Orwell, and there's a lot about the anarchist versus Stalinist conflict going on, and Stalin's agents out there committing terrible crimes, not only against priests and right-wingers, but their rivals on the left. That has tended to distort the way people have seen Spain, perhaps. Absolutely,
and of course it's one of the great difficulties for any serious historian of this period that Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is regarded as the great book. I mean, Homage to Catalonia is about as important for the historiography of the Spanish Civil War as, say, Spike Milligan's Hitler, My Part in His Downfall is for the history of the Second World War. Now, very important in both cases, about what it was like to be a foot soldier, but absolutely no vision of what was really going on.
So let's come on to some of the numbers and the facts. In terms of the quantity of civilians killed during the war, just take us through some of the key periods.
Well, the figures are horrendous, come what may. I mean, I obviously in the book make a big distinction between what happened on both sides. But one of the ways in which the Franco regime was able to give the impression that what it was doing, was a good thing, was the fact that there were substantial atrocities committed within the Republican zone. Not, I hasten to add, at the behest of the Republican authorities. We know with considerable accuracy that about 50,000 people were murdered, which is an astonishing and a horrendous figure. Not, of course, the 500,000 that Franco himself claimed. On the other side, we know that because records were kept at the time by the Republican authorities, and there was immediate sort of state investigation.
And these were people like the anarchist Iron Guard and so on, who were carrying out these atrocities, shooting prisoners of war, that kind of thing.
Well, one of the problems was that with the collapse of law and order that took place as a result of the military rebellion, the anarchists let common criminals out. As far as the anarchists were concerned, the bank robbers and murderers were actually warriors in the social struggle. So a lot of this was the work of common criminals. A lot of it was the work of anarchists who believed that you had to, if you like, create a tabula rasa, to start to create a new society.
But on the other side, on the side of the Francoists, you have many, many stories of what happens when one of the great columns, like General Moller's column, arrives in a town or a village.
Absolutely. I mean, I said that the atrocities behind the Republican lines were horrendous at 50,000, but behind the rebel lines, they are. We know the names of 130,000 people, but there are so many areas that haven't been investigated at all that it is perfectly reasonable to extrapolate 150,000, and it may very well be many, many more. But the differences aren't just quantitative, they're also qualitative, because behind the Republican lines there were serious efforts by the authorities to put a stop to it, and they were finally successful by about January 1937. In the rebel zone, they were deliberate. It was part of a prior plan of extermination, hence the use of the word extermination.
And this goes back to the sort of paranoid view that there was a Bolshevist, Jewish conspiracy against Catholic Spain. Huge numbers of people were simply evil and had to be removed.
Absolutely, but because the farcical thing was that Jews, there were hardly any Jews in Spain, about 2,500 who were exiles from Nazi Germany. Bolsheviks, well, the Communist Party had about 3,000 members, and Freemasons, there were 5,500. And yet this was the excuse for effectively an attempt to eliminate half of Spain.
Now, how do we know so much about this? Because I suppose this is the last moment when the grandchildren, at least, of many of the people who were murdered have a chance to discover what happened.
Well, the immediate families, of course, of the victims were brought up in silence, and their children were brought up in silence. And it was really only at the end of the last century that the grandchildren started to push for knowledge about what had happened. Not least, of course, in the context that the transition to democracy had seen a general feeling, don't rock the boat. Whatever happens, we must never return to a dictatorship. We must never risk another civil war. And it was the grandchildren who pushed for this. And so at the beginning, from about 2000 onwards, there started to emerge all over Spain they were called Associations for the Recovery of Historical Memory. And actually, I mean, I couldn't have written my book had it not been for them, because I was able to create a network of links with these people.
And these local historians, as it were, are very often people like shopkeepers or garage owners. They're not necessarily the professors you might expect.
Absolutely. I mean, in general, the Spanish universities have been pretty remiss in terms of work on this, and there's been virtually nothing in the way of government funding. So, for instance, the great historian of southwest Spain runs a petrol station. The great historian of the atrocities on both sides in Valencia, I mean, on the Republican side during the war, and on the Francoist side, excuse me, on the Francoist side afterwards, runs an estanco, which is a sort of little tobacconist, and that's the story all over Spain.
And just before we open this up for more general conversation, after the war is over, again, people look away from Spain. The Second World War is kicking off, and Spain is, although the Germans and the Gestapo and so on are welcomed into Spain by Franco's officers, as you make clear, the rest of the world doesn't know very much about what happened to all the Republican prisoners and those who'd been on the losing side.
Yes, I'm not sure that the rest of the world particularly wanted to know, but we have nearly 500,000 people. Excuse me. We have nearly 500,000 people in exile. There are nearly 1 million people in concentration camps and prisons. The executions carry on. There is absolutely nothing in the way of reconciliation. We have the head of Franco's psychiatric services conducting experiments on women prisoners to see if he can find the red gene and so on. So it's a pretty horrendous situation. But of course, as you say, with the Second World War about to begin, Spain is very much a backwater.
Maria Delgado, as I said right at the beginning, your own family is part of this story. How important do you think it is for modern Spain that there has been this process of don't ask, don't tell for so long?
I think that process was, certainly in the aftermath of the dictatorship, was a way in which Spain could move forward. It felt that it was too dangerous to look back. We have to embrace democracy. We have to forget what happened. We can't possibly risk the possibility of a new civil war. So for a long time, people just didn't think about that. But I think the point that Paul was making earlier about generations who were dying and their memories were dying with them has involved a change of perspective. And so we're really seeing from the end of the 20th century into the 21st, the beginning of people of my generation wanting to know what happened to our grandparents. My own grandfather, we never knew what happened to him until relatively recently. We think he died in the Argel-sur-Mer concentration camp in France. He was attempting to flee Spain. He was a Republican soldier. But we didn't know this for over 60, 70 years. And it's really been the process of historical memory, the law of historical memory that was introduced in 2007 that has allowed for a systematic thinking forward, a public space for these ideas to be debated. My own father, who came to Britain in 1937, one of almost 4,000 child refugees to escape the Basque Country in the aftermath of the Guernica bombing, he really wouldn't talk about it because his view was, it could endanger my family in Spain.
But also your mother came from the other side.
My mother came from the other side. My mother was one of the economic migrants that left Spain in the 1960s, late 50s, early 60s. Over 1 million left Spain between 1960 and 1966 for Northern Europe, to seek a better life in Northern Europe. Strange enough, we're going to see the same pattern, I think, happening over the next 5 years with the economic crisis in Spain at the moment. But yeah, my mother's family were nationalists. They were rebels who took the name nationalists because they believed that Spain was theirs. They were the national force of Spain. And they told a very different version of history. They told the fact that the Civil War was a crusade and it had allowed for the Catholic Church to be restored to its proper place in Spanish society. So two very polarised images of history, two very different narratives being told.
Daniel Hannan, you've been a sort of lover of Spain and travelling to Spain for a long period of time. How important, we are in the middle of this crisis, how important when we're trying to understand Spain is it to know about the aftermath of the Civil War, the oddness of the way the transition to democracy happened?
Tremendously important. I mean, every country has its central fact, and obviously this one is Spain's. One of the extraordinary things as a visitor to Spain, for a long time, really until this century, is that it was almost impossible to get anybody to talk about what happened between 1936 and 1939. As soon as people sensed that the conversation might be trending in that direction, they would very politely and very discreetly change the subject. And at first I thought that was because I was a foreigner, but I came to realise that there was something much more to it than that there were reasons that they wanted to leave the whole foul business buried. As Paul said, the atrocities were really behind the lines. The front line in the Spanish Civil War was a pretty ramshackle Iberian affair with sort of vast amounts of ordnance lobbed ineffectively back and forth. The horrors took place with people being dragged out of bed and shot or killed in prisons and so on. And so there were reasons why people didn't want to talk about it. And about 10 years ago, that began to change. So up until then, if you wanted, as a Spaniard, to read a decent history of the Civil War, you relied on the works of English historians in translation. You'd read Hugh Thomas, you'd read Paul's book on Franco, it was the definitive standard work, you'd read Anthony Beevor's book, that was how you would get your facts. Round about the beginning of this century, in little local initiatives, people started writing the stories of their village, their town during the war, the house-to-house atrocities, the collaboration horizontale, all of these things, and something broke, and people then wanted to come out and tell the story. And I think there was a key moment with the publication of a novel called Soldados de Salamina, Soldiers of Salamis, which wasn't a novel about the Civil War, it was a novel about a man writing the novel in a rather sort of South American way. But what it really was saying, why was one side not allowed to remember or honour its dead? And that touched a nerve, and shortly after that, there was a change of government. The Zapatero government got in and began, if you like, both as an exemplar and a beneficiary of this process and a driver of it, to say, well, actually, there's a lot of things that we need to talk about. Zapatero's own grandfather had been shot as a Republican officer, and I think the real imbalance, because I think Paul he's very interested in the atrocities on one side, and although he touches on the Republican atrocities, I think there's a lot more to be said about that. The real imbalance was not so much about who were the goodies and baddies. You know, these things there are good and bad people on both sides in any war. It's con matices, as they say in Spain. It's shades of grey. But the real imbalance was that one side was allowed to honour its fallen, and the other until now wasn't.
This huge monument to Franco built with slave labour, for instance, which I suppose is the ultimate sort of example of that, Paul.
Well, the Valle de los Caídos, yes. I mean, it does symbolise it all, the fact that there was slave labour. And, of course, many of the fortunes that were created, many of the big enterprises, particularly the construction companies in Spain, were built on that slave labour. And, of course, it also benefited foreign companies. I mean, I was recently reading some reports from British mining companies where people were, sort of chairmen of companies were praising the fact that productivity had gone up. What they didn't go into detail was that prior to the war, there'd been limits, sort of health and safety limits, on how long a worker could work in a mercury mine, not more than 4 hours a day for 3 days a week. Once the rebels took over, of course, it was a 6-day week, 8 hours, 6 days a week.
Yeah.
You know, of course, productivity went up.
Ian Begg, we're going to talk a little bit about the economics of all of this in a moment. But how important do you think it is when we're talking about the pool of the European Union and the importance to Spain of Europeanness, that there is this history to deal with one way or another?
Spain, until the fall of Franco, was a very closed economy. And as a closed economy, it was not at all integrated into the rest of Europe. So the significant thing that accession to the European Union did, or at least the promise of it from the mid-1970s onwards, was to offer a way of modernising the Spanish economy by drawing in foreign investment, by opening up trade. Much of what we now talk about as being the single market was the great pull from an economic point of view. Now, clearly also there was the political pull that other speakers have mentioned, which is one which says you can anchor this new fledgling democracy in the institutions of the European Union as a way of getting round this legacy that is bearing so heavily on, as Daniel has said.
We can become ordinary Europeans through, yes. And coming, Daniel, there's a big problem with this, of course, as well.
Well, for a whole generation of Spaniards, Europe symbolised everything that the dictatorship wasn't. The transition coincided with the preparation for and then the application to the European Union. So Europe, on a kind of subliminal level, meant being able to travel. It meant the Beatles and miniskirts and watching what you wanted on television and getting away from the civil guards and so on. I've noticed that in this country, when people say outside Europe you'd be isolated, it doesn't really have much resonance. Very few British people really think that we would be cut off from the world. It just doesn't make any sense to us. We have friends and family and trading links. To Spaniards of a certain age, isolation is not an abstract noun. They appreciated what it meant to be cut off in a dictatorial regime. And so the whole European debate is seen through this prism of, are we a modern liberal country, or are we some sort of quasi-African little forgotten corner of Europe? I mean, Spain, I've noticed, is one of the very few places other than Britain where people talk about going to Europe, meaning to the rest of the continent.
Paul Preston?
I think I think an interesting point is that in Britain, people, rightly or wrongly, have a sense of a real pride in national history, whereas for most 20th century Spaniards, it was just one disaster after another. You know, the whole of the 19th century was about a sort of shameful loss of empire, culminating in the final loss in 1898.
Corrupt monarchy
there's just so much, if you like, to be ashamed of. So for the reasons that both Ian and Daniel have said, people just embraced Europe as something different, when in addition it started to bring a better transport system, a better health system, and apparently unlimited credit. Well, why wouldn't you like Europe?
Yes, and indeed in this kind of reimagining of Spanish history, Maria, the importance of film and theatre can't be underestimated. Almodovar in particular, the great director.
Pedro Almodóvar symbolised the new Spain that emerged post the dictatorship. So that transition, he emerged during the transition to democracy, and he made a very different kind of thing. When we think about the films that characterised the 60s, the dictatorship, they were often, certainly the films seen on the international festival circuit, were films dealing with allegory. They were coded treatments of what was happening in Spain, and everybody kind of nodded and winked and understood what the subtext of what was being discussed was. Almodóvar presented in-your-face cinema that showed how exhilarated and excited this new generation of Spaniards were by what freedom and democracy would offer them. So he embodied that mentality, which was about looking forward. In
this country, we can hardly imagine having a film director that important, can we? I mean, this is, again, something unique to Spain.
But I think one of the things about Almodóvar is the way in which he has evolved as Spain has evolved. So, his own filmmaking has embraced the foreign possibility, the European possibility, certainly for distribution and co-funding. Also, the idea of historical memory. If you think about his films really until the mid to late 80s, they're about looking forward. Over the past 6-7 years, he has become increasingly interested and been part of this momentum in the cultural sphere for people to look at what happened in the past.
Down your hand.
I always feel, watching Almodóvar, rather like I feel after reading Larkin. It's technically brilliant, but it never makes me feel any better at the end than I was before I started. And I think the reason for that with Almodóvar is a very authentically Spanish quality, which is the morbidity of the thing. There is a claustrophobic and deathly feel to a lot of his films. And I think this is something, we conventionally say of a great artist that they're universal in their appeal, but actually there's nothing particularly universal about this. It's something we're very uninterested in Britain. We're a very necrophobic society. That isn't the case in Spain. And actually, one of the things, funnily enough, that I felt reading Paul's book is the peculiar horrors of what happened behind the lines in the Civil War were partly because of this attitude to death. One of the things which you didn't go into, but you've touched on in other books, Paul, was the way in which anarchists had such a horror of imprisoning people that they thought killing them was much better for all concerned. In a lot of the priest killings, there was almost a bizarre echo of the Passion, that the blood sacrifice of the priest brings in the great new age of the Republic. Hemingway captures this in For Whom the Bell Tolls, when they kill the people in Ronda, that they all turn up in their Sunday best as though for church, and with the blood spilt from the priest comes the new age. And that is an authentically Spanish characteristic, which I think in Protestant countries we just don't have. I
have to say that we must always remember that the scene in For Whom the Bell Tolls, in which people are thrown off the Tajo, the gorge in Ronda, is completely apocryphal. But nonetheless, what Daniel says in general is absolutely true. One thing Maria hasn't said, but I'm sure she knows about, is Almodóvar at the moment is involved in an extraordinary campaign about the search for the dead, with a series of clips, very small, but they had an enormous impact on the internet. And if in some cases he appears, in some cases it's actors, and they take the names of the dead and they say, I'm so and so. This is what happened to me. Look for me. Yes. It's called Buscame.
I mean, absolutely. One of the projects he's working on is also a screenplay based on the memoirs of Marcos Ana. And Marcos Ana, his book, his autobiography, Decirme cómo es un árbol, Tell Me What a Tree Looks Like, is about his own process. He was imprisoned for 23 years during the Franco dictatorship. And one of the things that Almodóvar has talked about is that book being about reconciliation. He wants to make a film that is about the possibilities of forgiveness, and he sees Marcos Ana almost like a Nelson Mandela figure. In terms of trying to stop this intolerance that has characterised Spanish society. You talked about Javier Cercas earlier, Dan, and one of the things that Cercas has talked about is intolerance being a national sin, because we have a tradition of dictatorship and inquisition. We kill people for thinking differently for us. And I think figures like Cercas and Almodóvar have tried to think of a cultural space where some of these things can be explored in a more complex manner.
Well, I think we've kind of started to lay out some of the Spanish difference for people. Ian Begg, I'd like now to turn to the economic plight that Spain is in at the moment, because although Spain and Greece at the moment, and to a certain extent Portugal and Italy, are all being bracketed together, these are very different economies, of course, and in very different kinds of trouble.
They are indeed, and I think there's some loose talk amongst journalists in the commentariat about saying Southern Europe is all one huge problem of the same nature. What's happened in Spain is that the property sector went on a runaway boom during the last decade before the crisis hit. In that respect, it was very much like Ireland, and to a considerable degree like the UK and the US, where private debt was ramped up as a way of keeping the economy going. It manifested itself in Spain, particularly in the construction sector, which rose to phenomenal shares of GDP.
There's still these vast stretches of sort of new build flats and houses and stuff all over across the south of Spain.
But to put it in perspective, the investment in construction in Spain meant that the share of investment in the economy went as high as 35% just before the crisis hit. Now, that's completely unsustainable. People don't need that number of houses.
No.
But the other side of it was that the Spanish economy was booming. It was bringing in huge numbers of migrants from Latin America and, curiously, from Romania, where we have the Polish plumber, perhaps they have the Romanian roofer. And that's the sort of change that's taken place. Now, what's happening is that as that property cycle turned downwards, something the UK experienced in the late 1980s, early 1990s, negative equity, trouble for the banks, which have loaned the money to the individuals who built the property, that imposes a huge brake on the economy. And that's what they're trying to contend with now. It's a totally different phenomenon from what's going on in Greece, which is the public sector.
And hugely high unemployment. This is something that goes back through Spanish history. But how are the Spanish coping with this at the moment? Because I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of social impact of this.
Well, the Spanish unemployment rate is now up to 22-23% and is particularly high in the youth sector, where nearly half of youths are registered as being unemployed. It's probably something of a false figure insofar as there's a very strong informal economy of people being paid without going through the books. And that means that although the unemployment figures look horribly dramatic, there isn't the upsurge of poverty you might expect to see associated with such high levels of unemployment. It's also worth noting that 20 years ago, unemployment rates in Spain were more or less the same level as they are now, and they came through that quite successfully.
So what are we going to see? Do we think we're going to see more mass migration out of Spain?
Well, it's certainly already started. I mean, there are a lot of young, qualified Spaniards, highly qualified Spaniards going to Germany, and I guess some will come here as things we hope improve here. There are more dramatic consequences. I have friends who live in the south of Spain who run a sheep farm, and their main concern is rustlers from local towns. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence about people suffering crop theft and so on, which is obviously is evidence of hunger.
And Maria, there's also, of course, a lot of people, as it were, just going back to the land, and in a way that wouldn't happen in this country. People do still have space to go back to.
Absolutely. You see it in Almodovar's film Volver, where they're talking about living in a grotty apartment in the city and not having enough to eat there when they've got beautiful spatial property in a gorgeous part of rural Spain. So I think you are seeing that. I think that it's been a real issue, I think, for the cultural industries, the whole crisis that Spain has been going. When we think about Spain over the last 25, 30 years, we've been thinking about a cultural upheaval. We've been thinking about consolidation of a really vibrant theatrical art and cinematic culture. And I think that's being challenged by things that are happening in the economy, because theatre companies are not being paid to go on tour. Their tour, a lot of the theatres are controlled by local councils. They go and play there. They're not paid, and this is leading to a culture where some of the most exciting theatre artists in Spain cannot make a living.
And pursuing that thought, Daniel, just talk a little bit about the way that the Spanish state behaves when you get a change of government and so on, because we've now got a conservative government in Spain. But
it's quite extraordinary. I mean, for weeks after an election, you will be reading in the newspapers about theatre directors being appointed, generals being appointed, and this is a tradition that goes back well before the dictatorship. In the 19th century in Spain, there were two parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, and they would alternate in office, rather like those figures on a weather thing that would tell you whether it was, and when it was your turn, all of your mates would get into power and the other lot would go more or less complainingly. That is the basis of an extremely bloated public sector, to put it as neutrally as possible. That is not a culture where you're easily going to be able to reduce state spending, where you have this expectation from people who feel that they hold an IOU because they voted for you.
So Ian Begg, we've got a Conservative government, but looking for things that a Conservative government from Britain wouldn't be looking for when it comes to the European crisis now.
Once again, I think we need to put this in perspective, because what you've seen across Europe is the incumbent governments being kicked out and blamed for the crisis. Almost everywhere, with one or two exceptions, that's happened. But we need also to put in perspective the magnitude of the downturn in the Spanish economy. The Spanish economy has lost less growth than the UK. Its public sector debt today, even today in projections for 2012, is lower as a proportion of national income than Germany's, much lower than the UK's, half of Greece's. So
why is it at the centre of the crisis then?
The reason it's at the centre of the crisis is the uncertainty about what's going on in the banking sector. In Ireland, what happened was the banks were deemed to be more or less insolvent. They had to be bailed out by the state, and that transferred bank debt onto the public books. The fear is that something similar is going to happen in Spain as bad debts in the property market turn into problems for the banks. So it's not the individual that's in trouble, it's the bank that's in trouble. And if the bank's in trouble, then the state's in trouble. That's why the markets are attacking Spain. But we just don't know at this point how bad the problem is.
I mean, there was a colossal expansion of Spanish banking. The catchphrase in London was, "No one expects the Spanish acquisition," because Spain had outgrown its domestic market and Spanish banks were buying up equity all over the world. And the worry is that they are on the cusp of the kind of debt crisis that Ireland has been through and that other countries have. I mean, Spain, in a way, is an extreme form of what a lot of Western countries are suffering, which is that it had a boom that was based on borrowing. People were increasing their consumption without any commensurate increases in production, and they were bridging the gap with debt. And there was bound to come a moment when the money ran out, and we have reached that moment now. Spain is by no means unique in this. It's only, in a sense, it started from further behind and it went quicker. The sudden sprouting of all the curiously shaped architectural buildings and stuff was more extreme and more concertinaed in Spain.
So does this mean that, in a different way, but in a parallel way, like Greece, Spain is going through a sort of existential crisis about what sort of society, what sort of country it is?
It is, but
Maria.
The question is whether it's going to do anything about it. I mean, one of the things that you were talking about, Dan, was this idea of cronyism, and a new government comes in and they put all of their own in place. A number of years back, there was quite a lot of excitement in Spain because Tamara Rojo, the ballet dancer who was named last month as the new director, the incoming director of English National Ballet, there were talks about whether she'd come back to Spain to head a new national classical ballet company. She wanted the establishment of an arts council in Spain so that you didn't
Arm's length from the politicians.
Arm's length from the politics. And her reason, I thought this is a wonderful line, is I have to know that in 3 years' time, some politician won't come along and put his cousin in my place. And I'm afraid there's too much of that in place. So you get these huge white elephant projects. You've got the Niemeyer Cultural Centre in Asturias that was built for something like 44 million euros. It closed after 9 months because of political squabbling between the local government that was funding it. You've got Castellón Airport, which again, I think it was 150 million, and it's not operative. In fact, they've just found out that the runway doesn't meet with regulations.
Put your finger on it.
It's a joke.
Ian Begg.
Equally, you have the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which has been a huge success in fostering the economic development and economic regeneration of the Basque Country. So I think you should be rather careful to say every cultural project is a waste of money.
I wouldn't argue that. I think that Guggenheim was really important, but it was built after a really long feasibility study. A lot of these places, they just thought, well, they've got a Guggenheim, we want a Guggenheim.
The building's a bit better than the contents, let's be honest.
But still,
All right, Paul Preston.
I think one of the central problems here, both in terms of the debt, of course, we have this bizarre situation of 17 autonomous regions, of 13 of which have actually no historical rationale. We have the whole issue of the fact that corruption is rampant and the links between banks and politicians are shady, to put it mildly. We have, if you like, a kind of cultural mindset in which public service is seen as not for public benefit, but for private benefit. And finally, it seems to be one thing we keep forgetting is that none of this credit boom in Spain would have been possible had there not been German banks prepared to lend to the Spanish banks.
So does that, you would suggest, therefore, Daniel Hand, that actually Europeanisation has allowed Spain to carry on in the bad old ways rather than to modernise as it ought to have done?
Europeanisation, or specifically European economic and monetary union, has turned what ought to have been a containable problem into a global calamity. Spain would have had problems anyway, as a number of Western countries would. I'm not going to blame it all on the euro. But the euro prevented the markets from stepping in and imposing their own corrective earlier. And the truth is, when you've had an artificial credit boom, as they've had in Spain, big time, at the end, what is supposed to happen is that the bad investments that were made during the decade and a half of artificially cheap credit are corrected. And that's a painful process. It involves a decline in
losing
living
their
standard.
money. Yeah.
Right, and there's no getting around that. But the alternative is like trying to stave off the hangover by remaining drunk. I mean, you get a temporary illusion of bien-être with every extra shot you take, but actually you can't defer it forever. And the idea that you can postpone this reckoning by just borrowing more, spending more, stimulating the economy is simply crazy. It's going to make it far worse when it eventually happens.
Ian Begg.
It is nevertheless important to have regard to what's actually changing the Spanish economy. Productivity is increasing now because of the reforms that are taking place. Both the outgoing Zapatero government and Rajoy's incoming government have made changes to the labour protections. They're trying to unwind a legacy of Franco, in fact, which was the very strong labour protection. And the result of this is that in the last period, it was the protected permanent workers who started to lose their jobs rather than the temporary workers who've been the original victims. So I think you're beginning to see significant transformation on the supply side of the Spanish economy, which is the sort of pressure you expect to come from this kind of crisis. I'm tolerably optimistic about Spain. I don't actually believe that Spain is going to have a massive exodus of talent of the sort we're talking about, because it's dealing with this crisis in a reasonably measured way. The great difficulty is the uncertainty in the banking sector. That's what they need to worry most about. And there the European Central Bank has made it clear it's going to try to assist by making liquidity available.
And so when we're sitting here at a time when lots and lots of people are now thinking that Greece is going to exit the euro one way or another, it's sort of 50-50 according to the bookies and so on, but you don't think the same applies to Spain? No,
the Spanish economy is not bust in the way the Greek economy is bust, and that is such a huge and significant difference. Go back to the figure I quoted about the scale of public debt, that it has to be brought onto the table.
I agree with that. I mean, the Spanish no economy in Europe is bust in the way that the Greek economy is bust, but Spain, I would say, is more resilient than Portugal or than Italy, even in its basic figures. Nonetheless, I think it is plainly the lesser evil for Spain to default, devalue, decouple, to price itself into the market and to escape an overvalued exchange rate. If it were another country than Spain, if people didn't have this sense that the euro is a talisman of belonging to Europe rather than Africa, all the things we were talking about before, symbolising the end of dictatorship, I think there would be a much more vigorous debate there about whether Spain would be better off suiting its own monetary policy to its own conditions.
So, Paul Prest, we've got two things going on at the moment. We've got the financial crisis and the European crisis going on in Spain, and we've also got this kind of huge upsurge in remembering and confronting the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath. Are they in any way related, do you think? Just a coincidence?
No, I think they're part of a general one. It's a desencanto, a kind of disenchantment with politics in general, and of course we see that all over Europe just because of the economic crisis.
What's the word? The indignant ones,
Los indignados, yes. Which of course are like the occupiers of public spaces again in lots of parts of the developed world. It's an odd one, really. When say a book by me or books of this nature are published in Spain, quite unlike anything that one could imagine in this country, they make front page news in the papers. One gets endlessly interviewed on radio and television and so on. And in fact, anything to do with the whole historical memory issue is front page news. And one could get the impression from that that the Spanish Civil War is still going on. Now, at one level, it is, but on the other hand, what people are really concerned about is getting to the end of the month and being able to feed the family, to making sure that the kids get to a decent school. So it's relative. Of course, there are lots of families that are burning with, that's more than curiosity, a desperate need to know, a desperate need for closure. But, of course, there have been now 3 generations have grown up since the death of Franco, and if you do surveys, you'll find that lots of school kids don't even know who Franco was.
Maria Delgado.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point that Paul's just making about new revelations about the Civil War and its aftermath being front page news, you see that with the fascination that Federico García Lorca, Spain's greatest 20th century writer, still holds on the public imagination. Just less than a week ago, a new poem emerged that he'd written to one of his last lovers, Juan Ramón de Lucas, and this was all over the Spanish press. It even made it into The Guardian here on Saturday. And I think for many reasons, Lorca functions as a figurehead, if you like, for the writers, the intellectuals, the silenced ones, the ones whose history couldn't be told in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Big Lorca fan, Daniel.
I am a big Lorca fan, and there, if you really want morbidity, I can't think of a writer in the 20th century in any language as obsessed with death, his own and other people's. And so there was something almost eerie about the fact that he was murdered in the way that he was, having foreseen his own death in a poem in which he predicted that he'd be carried away and shot.
And something symbolic about the fact that when he was exhumed, he wasn't there.
Well, isn't that just the perfect... I mean, it's like it is almost what you'd expect from an Almodovar film. It's exactly the empty grave. I mean, it's a fascinating question, this unearthing of the past. And it's one on which people often feel very strongly, and it's much more finely balanced than you realise. It's not simply which side you were on in the Civil War. There was a real sense of, do we want to be disturbing ghosts and so on? And I think the truth is, if you're digging people up and you're unearthing the past figuratively as well as literally, you need to do it patiently. You need to do it like an archaeological dig with gentle brushwork, and you need to respect what you're finding. And the difficulty some people had in the very early times when this started 10 years ago is that they felt that the Zapatero government was taking a spade through it, that it was using the dead for political purposes. Now, I'm glad to say I think we've passed that phase now, and I think we're doing it in a much more measured way. And it is important that we hear this, because people are not going to be around to tell their memories for much longer.
Well, our ability for spade work or gentle brush work has come to an end. Thank you to all my guests, the MEP Daniel Hannan, the economist Ian Begg. Maria Delgado's A History of Theatre in Spain is out now, as is Paul Preston's The Spanish Holocaust, Inquisition and Extermination in 20th century Spain. Next week, we're going to be talking about morality, money and the markets with Michael Sandel, Grigory Yavlinsky and Diane Coyle. But for now, thank you and goodbye. So on, who were carrying out these atrocities, shooting prisoners of war, that kind of thing.
Well, one of the problems was that with the collapse of law and order that took place as a result of the military rebellion, the anarchists let common criminals out. As far as the anarchists were concerned, the bank robbers and murderers were actually warriors in the social struggle. So a lot of this was the work of common criminals. A lot of it was the work of anarchists who believed that you had to, if you like, create a tabula rasa,
Yes.
to start to create a new society.
But on the other side, on the side of the Francoists, you have many, many stories of what happens when one of the great columns, like General Moller's column, arrives in a town or a village.
Absolutely. I mean, I said that the atrocities behind the Republican lines were horrendous at 50,000, but behind the rebel lines, they are. We know the names of 130,000 people, but there are so many areas that haven't been investigated at all that it is perfectly...
During the war, just take us through some of the key periods.
Well, the figures are horrendous, come what may. I mean, I obviously in the book make a big distinction between what happened on both sides, but one of the ways in which the Franco regime was able to give the impression that what it was doing, was a good thing, was the fact that there were substantial atrocities committed within the Republican zone. Not, I hasten to add, at the behest of the Republican authorities. We know with considerable accuracy that about 50,000 people were murdered, which is an astonishing and a horrendous figure. Not, of course, the 500,000 that Franco himself claimed. On the other side, we know that because records were kept at the time by the Republican authorities, and there was immediate sort of state investigation.
And these were people like the anarchist Iron Guard and a lot of British people who are interested in Spain in that period. We see things through the spectacles of George Orwell, and there's a lot about the anarchist versus Stalinist conflict going on, and Stalin's agents out there committing terrible crimes, not only against priests and right wingers, but their rivals on the left. That has tended to distort the way people have seen Spain, perhaps.
Absolutely, and of course it's one of the great difficulties for any serious historian of this period, that Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is regarded as the great book. I mean, Homage to Catalonia is about as important for the historiography of the Spanish Civil War as, say, Spike Milligan's Hitler, My Part in His Downfall
Ouch.
is for the history of the Second World War. Now, very important in both cases, about what it was like to be a foot soldier, but absolutely no vision of what was really going on.
So let's come on to some of the numbers and the facts. In terms of the quantity of civilians killed. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, in today's news, Spain is again at the centre of the European crisis. The weekend saw big demonstrations in towns and cities across the country. And today we're going to be looking more closely at what makes Spain unique in modern Europe, perhaps above all her civil war and its long legacy of dictatorship and the decision to forget, or try to forget, which followed the return to democracy. Maria Delgado's father was a refugee in the 1930s, and she's a historian of Spanish theatre and film. Daniel Hannon's a conservative Eurosceptic MEP and a long-term Hispanophile, if that's the word. It makes him sound a little bit like a very fine veteran car. Ian Begg's an economist specialising in European integration and governance, but we're going to start with a remarkable new account of the Spanish Civil War and its legacy by Paul Preston, which is called The Spanish Holocaust, Inquisition and Extermination in 20th Century Spain. Well, those are big words to be using about a dictator, Franco, who has been in many ways put in a slightly different category than the other monsters of the 20th century.
Well, in fact, part of the choice of those words was, in a sense, a response to the fact that Franco has such a good press in the Anglo-Saxon world. And the fact that he has such a good press is largely to do with the fact that there were more than 30 years after the end of the Second World War in which he and his regime, with control of the media and the education system, were able to, if you like, peddle a particular version of what happened. And of course, they also benefited greatly from the sense that they were important allies of the West during the Cold War, and perhaps above all, had 30 years in which to destroy the evidence. So Franco's reputation as a benign dictator is hardly merited.
Well, let's come on to the details in a moment, but I suppose the other thing is that for an awful